The Jubilee Line extension is one of London's newest underground lines, and even though it's nearly a quarter of a century old, it still feels modern and even futuristic. It serves some of London's most important destinations: the seat of government at Westminster, the major stations of Waterloo, London Bridge and Stratford, the O2 at North Greenwich, and London's second financial centre at Canary Wharf. And then there's Bermondsey. Bermondsey Station sits between Canada Water and London Bridge in south-east London. Historically, the area south of the river has always been underserved by the tube. So how did we get here? Bermondsey has a long and laudable history. From at least the 11th century until the turbulent reign of Henry VIII, it was home to Bermondsey Abbey. With the Industrial Revolution, this became the larder of London. Goods would be brought into the docks and wharves south of the river, and they would be processed in the factories. Not just food, but wool, leather and hides were all brought here. The wealth of Bermondsey was tied to the docks. And that was great, as long as the docks were there. But the second half of the 20th century brought change. The docks moved downriver as ships grew too big for the old port. With nothing to anchor them here, the factories moved away, and Bermondsey suffered a decline. A glimmer of hope came towards the end of the 20th century, and it would come from downriver. But I'm skipping ahead here. In the 1970s, a new underground line was under construction. This was to be called the Fleet Line. It would take over part of the Bakerloo line from Stanmore to Baker Street. Then it would travel through new tunnels to Charing Cross. The question then was, what next? The line as it stood was only half the plan. I mean, you could hardly call it the Fleet Line when it went nowhere near the River Fleet, could you? Why, they'd laugh at you, that's what they'd do. London Transport were pretty sure that the next stage was an extension to Fenchurch Street via Aldwych and Ludgate Circus. From there were two main possibilities. One was that they would take the East London line over and run down to New Cross Gate and Lewisham. The other, a proposal known as the River Line, would criss-cross under this bendy part of the river, serving Surrey Docks North, Millwall, North Greenwich, Custom House and Silvertown before heading south and then east to Woolwich Arsenal and two stations in Thamesmead. A major objective of these extensions was to provide transport to the Docklands. The writing was on the wall for the docks, and providing decent transport links was seen as a means of mitigating the damage and helping the area to recover economically from the loss of its biggest employers. In 1979, the first stage of the new tube line opened. Under political pressure, London Transport had been forced to name it the Jubilee Line, after the Queen's Silver Jubilee in 1977, which was a bit embarrassing given that the line wouldn't open for another 2 years. Still, a new tube line, that was pretty good, wasn't it? Behind the scenes, though, things were not looking so good. The estimated costs were rocketing, and by 1979 it was looking like it would cost at least £325 million to extend. No way, said the government, you are not having a tube line. Instead, the money set aside was put into roads in the area. You'll be sorry, said London Transport. The Docklands would eventually get a railway, but it would be a light railway. A Docklands light railway, if you will. The hope for the Docklands was that it would be regenerated with new housing, low-rise commercial premises, and light industry. So it came as a bit of a surprise in 1985 when an American gentleman named Gooch Ware Travelstead proposed something rather more radical. He would take the site of a lot of old warehouses on the Isle of Dogs, build a bunch of skyscrapers on them, and give London a brand new state-of-the-art commercial district. But this would need far better transport links than the area had. Travelstead, somewhat naively, imagined that the roads could handle it. The London Docklands Development Corporation offered a much larger Canary Wharf DLR station and an extension of the system into the city at Bank. But this wouldn't suffice in the long term for the scale of development. Travelstead wouldn't see his project through. His consortium sold out to Olympia and York, who told the government that they were going to have to get real about improving transport to Canary Wharf. The company proposed a private underground railway, something that hadn't been done since the early years of the century. This line, the Waterloo and Greenwich Railway, would have begun at London Waterloo, then run to Southwark, London Bridge, Surrey Docks, Isle of Dogs, Blackwall Point, Greenwich Parkway, and ultimately West Combe Park, with the option of extending into the West End up to Stratford or down to Woolwich and Thamesmead. You may have noticed that Bermondsey is not on there. But if the government thought that building a tube line was expensive in 1979, building one in 1988 was even worse. The King's Cross fire of 1987 had resulted in an overhauling of safety precautions, and any new tube line would have to be built with those in practice. It would need Olympia and York to find a lot of money. The government couldn't help because it was basically a commercial line that offered little by way of social benefits. But, said London Transport, there is another way. They met with Olympia and York to discuss a revival of the Jubilee Line extension scheme, a joint venture, broadly following the route of the private railway plan. Olympia and York agreed. A report was produced, and when that was favourably received, a bill was put to Parliament in 1989. While the government balked at the cost, the fact that it would be shared with the private sector did sweeten it a bit. The story of how the Jubilee line got from there to completion is a long and complicated one, and it occurs to me that for a video about Bermondsey Station I really haven't talked about Bermondsey Station much. Bermondsey was part of the social justification for the extension. The tubes had largely avoided South London due to a combination of poor soil and the fact that the area was well served by mainline railways and trams. So building a station here was rather novel. Despite the projected cost, London Transport were determined not to skimp on the new stations. Prior to the Jubilee line, the last new tube line had been the Victoria. Costs had been brought down by building stations to a bare minimum. They'd quickly proven inadequate as they became overcrowded. LT weren't going to make that mistake again. These new stations would be future-proofed. Bermondsey would be no exception. It was something of a gamble. No one could predict how popular the station would actually be. It could be just a thing that was handy to have, or it could end up serving a busy suburb of Dockland office workers. Initial projections suggested that it would have initially something in the region of 1/10 of the passenger numbers of Canary Wharf. The site chosen was on a corner in a largely residential area. As a matter of fact, it would sit on the site of the house of local doctor and campaigner against poverty Alfred Salter, to whom a plaque was unveiled in 2002. A basic design was part of the initial report on the extension submitted to Parliament, and in some ways Bermondsey was intended to be a prototype for future suburban stations. The architect in charge was Ian Ritchie. The original idea was to build a station that would feel something like Earl's Court in an open trench with a glass roof, lots of light and air. This would not only make for a pleasant passenger experience, but would also meet safety requirements by allowing plenty of space for emergency evacuation. Unfortunately, this dream was squashed by the soil conditions. The soil in South London is rather gravelly and waterlogged, much harder to build a tunnel through than the clay north of the river. What was needed was something that allowed maximum stabilisation. So the design settled on would consist of 2 tunnels to carry the tracks, but also a cut-and-cover concrete box. This would not be cheap, but it would be quicker than the usual tube station method of digging a bunch of corridors and shafts out of the soil. The station is bright and airy at the subsurface level, but this disguises the fact that much of the architecture is purely practical. Slabs and pillars working hard to contain the unstable soil all around. Ritchie described it as our most complex job so far, which is remarkable considering its relatively small scale as compared to, say, North Greenwich or Canary Wharf. There is some ornamentation, or jewellery as Ritchie described it, in the form of a blue glass frieze. This was reflected in the platform seats, but these have since been replaced by standard tube seats. I don't know why, I can't think of anything that could possibly go wrong with a glass seat. Like most of the other extension stations, it boasts platform doors that open for trains, making the platforms a lot safer. Bermondsey Station is theoretically quite an ordinary station compared to some of its fellows. It has no interchange, it doesn't serve a bustling commercial district, but the story behind it, its proposal, design and construction, well, when you know what went into it, it seems quite extraordinary. Well, I do hope you enjoyed today's well-braced tale from the tube. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like once more to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your always generous support. You are the socially conscious station to my expensive tube line. And I will see you all again very soon for another Tale from the Tube.